Hello and welcome to the Storied Arcs podcast. I am your co-host Mike.
And I'm your co-host Alex.
And today we are doing our spoiler-filled discussion of Deep Cuts written by Kyle Higgins and Joe Clark with art from the whole host of people. We'll get to them each as we go. I was going to start listing them now, and I was like, I think we're going to kind of loosely take an issue-by-issue approach. However, I don't think we're going to guarantee, like, oh, if you've only read the first two issues, you can listen to that part and stop. The whole thing is open for discussion.
Yeah, it's all on the table.
We'll hop around, but
I mean, this
is an
isn't
anthology.
Yeah, well, this isn't. This is the second anthology we've covered in this way. I mean, we the first one really was just a little while back when we covered Swan Songs during Death Month. Of course, that was more that was a thematic anthology, where they just they had an idea and then each artist kind of spun off on whatever their interpretation of that was, which is it's a very cool idea. It's an idea that I like in comics. But this structure that Deep Cuts has, this storytelling device of the like narrative anthology, where everything is separate, but yet it's all connected here and there. Like you can.
Well, let's talk about the way it's connected.
Okay,
like the best comp for me is Cloud Atlas. Did you read or watch Cloud Atlas?
No.
Oh, okay.
For me, I mean, my literal favorite comics of all time are all similar in structure, just over a longer period of time.
Okay.
Sandman, Criminal, Astro City, Fables to some extent. They're all anthology-like in that each arc is separate, but as you read all of them, you see how all of them connect into just one larger story. This is that just condensed down to 6 individual issues. So again, this kind of structure that's where my mind goes in terms of because comics are periodicals,
Sure.
They're by nature installments. So yeah, I love a book like this where you read an issue and then or an arc or whatnot, and then you read the next one and you're somewhere completely different, and especially in this case, you get a whole new artist, so totally different style, and yet you get that little Easter egg, of, oh, there's a connection here. And then
they don't beat you over the head with it.
Exactly.
Which I appreciate.
Yeah. And so it's a thing that if you're paying attention, or I think we mentioned last week, is the book that really benefits from a binge read, especially since as the series was coming out, there were some pretty big delays in the back half of the issues being released. When you read it all in trade and things are fresh in your mind, you're more likely to make those connections. And I think it's that much more enriching. And even if you don't, as you're going, I think by issue 6, that's the only place where it hits you on the head. Like if you didn't quite get it all the way through, by the end of 6, that's when they're being very explicit and overt about it. And then then you have kind of like the aha moment. And then I would hope you could go, if you went back to the beginning and reread it with those connections in mind, you then get a much more fulfilling experience. And so that kind of storytelling architecture, where they're just dropping little seeds in here and there, little Easter eggs for the reader, and getting to do that. I would say that's easy enough for the writers because they're the ones crafting the scripts and all that. But when you can also do that across different artists and have different artists take different swings and different takes on the characters, because they're all in different time periods. They're all in different locations when we see them throughout the series. I think that's a fun and interesting way to keep readers engaged. And like I said, it's one of my favorite kind of storytelling constructs.
Yeah. Quick pitch for you. I think Cloud Atlas is a movie worth watching once. The book is more worth reading, but it is 6 different stories one set in 1849, one in 1931, 1975, 1931, 2149, and another one in 2149. And all of them are connected by different little threads that are kind of subtle, but the more you read it, like it washes over you, like, oh, I'm seeing the themes. And then in the movie, they cast like Tom Hanks has a part in every part of the timeline. So there's like Ben Whishaw, Hugh Grant, Halle Berry, and like they were teasing it, like maybe the idea of reincarnation, or if not like a literal reincarnation, like a spiritual one, like this archetype, this person will always be here having this type of dilemma regardless of the time and the place. And
they use the same actors probably just as a visual shortcut for people so they don't
exactly and I think it was the most expensive indie movie ever made, displacing Phantom Menace, which is hilarious that counts as an indie movie, but the strong comps there of the cyclical nature is the very last page, which brings you right back to the first story. It's like a boy with his trumpet in New Orleans, or not even a trumpet, clarinet.
No. But no, I think the thing I like about deep cuts in specific is the idea of legacy. Like I think we said we would go issue to issue. We're not really doing that. But at the end there, when we're in issue 6, and our saxophonist in the band, who is Barry Newark, he's talking to Alice, and as he's tracking the history of the song that originated in New Orleans with our character Ace Stewart, he specifically uses mentor. His mentor played this song. And then his mentor used that and made this song and passed it down. So that idea of person to person connection, as passing down this music, and each time it changes hands, it morphs a little and changes a little, and the title changes a little, but there's still that connective tissue all the way back to issue 1 with Ace Stewart, New Orleans, 1917. You can take it all the way back 60 some odd years, and you get to what we'll call the beginning, at least the beginning of our story. And then you're right. In the end, it works its way all the way back, and we see a kid, down in the same area of the city that's entirely different, except the one saloon that's still there, which is the saloon that we saw in the beginning of issue 1. The idea that legacy continues on, that the music is passed down, the tradition is passed down, the knowledge is passed down from person to person, era to era, generation to generation. I love those kind of connective pieces.
Yeah, it's great. Let's jump into issue 1.
Sure.
We'll see where it all begins. I believe also chronologically, there are the story moves chronologically, like each chapter is I was like, so, I know there's a year stamp, but I'd never pieced together whether we're moving strictly forward in time, especially when you get to issue 4, which does jump around back and forth within the issue.
But you're
but it's all ahead of issues 1 through 3 and behind issue 4.
Yes, 5. That is, so 4 is the one that's a little more nebulous, and I believe the date that's given is the date of the interviews in that issue. Because they're talking about the character Dorian after he's passed at that point. But we'll get there. We'll start with issue 1. Issue 1, artist here, Danilo Beyruth, New Orleans, 1917. Our main character is this kid, Charles Ace Stewart. He plays the clarinet, and he's just looking to play music. And this is our kind of first era of jazz, right? I think on the first. Well, we're not the first page here, but so it starts with Ace walking through the city, right? He's listening, and he's trying to find a place to play. And there's they drop a couple band names there, and the first one is, I looked these up to double check, and the first one they mentioned is the original Steamboat Jazz Band, which I'm guessing, that's a fictional band. I'm guessing that was meant to be, or stand in for the original Dixieland Jazz Band, which is what
I mean, the whole issue is strong Dixieland vibes, which I think
100%,
maybe said in the Zero, like Dixieland is one of those jazz subgenres that I don't really get. I'm not disrespecting it. I always assume the deficiency is with me. When I'm assessing something that I don't like, I'm like, it's just beyond the realm of my taste, which is still developing. But I have heard, like, go to New Orleans, like spend time in New Orleans, and you'll hear Dixieland still played on street corners and at festivals and things like that. And if you don't like that, then fine, you don't like Dixieland. But if you're just like listening to recordings on Spotify, you're not really experiencing Dixieland jazz. And I was like, that's fair. So I will reserve judgment on the Dixieland of it all.
I went to New Orleans once back in high school. Our music department took a trip there our senior year, and there is just something about just hearing it emanating, just hearing music emanate from buildings and establishments, and hearing it on the sidewalk, and just being around it. You can't help but I'm not saying I like it, or at some point it becomes it's so overwhelming music wise. You're just it's just there, and
Right.
and it's so ingrained as you just like walking around and you're I don't know, trying to find a restaurant or whatever it is, or just walking anywhere through the streets. But there's something about, it's so ingrained, and you can't help but appreciate it and just kind of get into it. So
I think it's the same deal with the food too, right? It's like,
Yes.
you
Definitely.
can go to a New Orleans style restaurant outside of New Orleans, but like half of it is the atmosphere. Like the food's also really good.
Yeah.
But the atmosphere is so immersive. It's so of a piece that the music with the food and
that
the
does
old French
go
Quarter.
that does go for every kind of city. It's just it is the New Orleans experience you only get there. Just like the New York experience or whatever. They're radically different, but you can't replicate them anywhere else. Though there are certain cities that have a very particular flavor, and I think New Orleans is at the top of the list in the contiguous United States for being that kind of city, where it has such a specific vibe that it is not replicable anywhere else. There's just there's such a specific mix of everything that came true right there. And so God, I can't imagine what would have been at this time period, at the birth of what we now know as jazz and this Dixieland music, and what it would have been like at this time. And for a kid like our character here, Ace Stewart, right, as he's walking through and he's hearing all this music and he's passing on it. It's like, well, no, not that one. That's not the one that I want. He's looking for a place to crash a performance.
I mean, he's also, I think it's half looking for a muse and half looking for a venue. Like he's just kind of absorbing. He's clearly like, I don't think it's snobbery, which is not what you're saying, but I don't think he's like, oh, that's not good enough. I think he's just like, I feel that, but I gotta find the right place.
Yeah, it's when when you hear it, and he's like, okay, there it is, that's the one. As soon as he hears it, he knows that's the place I want to be, because that's the music right there. That's the one that's connecting with me. So I like this journey for him throughout this issue of him just coming to understand, and it feels particular to me that he's a younger kid starting up, and that's the start of our story. He's not some established artist. We see him, as his name and his character kind of reoccurs and looms over the whole series. The fact that he's just this kid that's totally raw, and is looking for gigs. He's looking to do this for a living. He's looking to make his way. And the story ends with him kind of getting a regular gig. This kind of someone entering the world, I think it feels very intentional of we're bringing you into this together. Our character, while he lives here, he's not part of the scene, and you, the reader, we're bringing you along. So the rejection he feels, the searching he feels, all of that, it comes through to the reader as Ace himself is going through these motions.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say, perhaps it's because it was the entry point to the book, but I think this might still be my favorite issue here. I think it's such a tight narrative. I think the kid is so relatable, and I think this is like the most outright plucky optimism. Which it's like I think the book is optimistic in general, but I do think he has chances to kind of veer off the straight and narrow, and he's like, "No, man, I'm just about the music. I'm not going to stab anybody in the back. I'm not going to screw anybody over. Just going to keep playing my music, and good things will happen for me." And they do relatively quickly, and Jack gets his comeuppance by the end of the issue.
The series is optimistic. Yeah, it's hopeful. The series is hopeful.
Right. I think it's like, even though each of our individual stories and situations isn't great, the thing we care most about lives on and keeps growing.
Yeah.
We're all nurturing this common project. And that thing grows. And I think that's the same mentality. I don't know why I'm thinking of this in 2025. That's the same mentality that I take to things like social justice and other things like that. I'm like, yeah, like it's gonna, like, everybody who sticks their neck out for it, it's awful, it's terrible, it does not lead to a good, happy life. But that the Martin Luther King Jr. quote, the moral arc is long but bent towards justice. It's like, well, maybe not innately, but certainly we bend it toward justice with these type of actions.
I think that's probably why this and issue 6 are my favorite, because in 6 I do like the wrap up when everything comes together and you see and they get explicit with the narrative arc of everything. Yeah. But I do love this issue, this first one. I think you're right, because there's a genuineness,
it's
goodness,
kind of feel good, not in a cheap way.
Yeah,
but I think
it's not in a maudlin way or anything like that. Yeah.
Also, like, penciling sketches in this one are outstanding, and the colors are next level.
I love the contrast of and this happens a lot throughout the series, and I think this has got to be partially why they only had one colorist, Igor Monti, all the way through, where there's a similar effect in terms of really, really warm brightness contrasted with very stark coldness. So you have reds and oranges and yellows, often depicting music, and then on the outside you have these blues and purples, what kind of when people aren't playing, and they use that contrast and throughout the entire book. But because the style is different, the way the colors are used and look are different, but you get the same feel. You get the same feel,
the same function.
Yeah. I do have one minor nitpick I'm gonna get out of the way right now.
For it,
they don't get so woodwind instruments when you're playing them. Left hand high, right hand low. Clarinet, saxophone. I played woodwinds growing up. I played both clarinet and saxophone. They don't always get it right, and I don't know if it was a matter of them reversing things around, because like sometimes his hands are in the right position, sometimes in the wrong position. Little things like that, they do kind of bother me. It doesn't take away from what's happening in the story. It's just one of those little things when I look at it. If I see the hand position is wrong, or if someone's holding an instrument quote unquote incorrectly, like, it just takes me out of it. I've been around banishments enough, and so in this situation,
it's funny you say that, because I had a brief moment of that with the guitars in issue 6. As a guitarist, but exactly. I was also like, it's like they probably started with the panel shape, and then they have to fit the subject in the panel, and so sometimes you just have to do certain things.
Well,
but
yeah,
I think anytime there's like a dedicated panel to him, like playing clarinet, I believe it's correct.
No, not so much. There isn't. There are some when it's just him, and he's very clear his hands are in the wrong position. So it's a small thing, but it is something that it's minor nitpick for me in terms of just like hand position, horn position, things like that. But it doesn't take away from the story. There's an interpretive aspect to it. That's fine. I get it. That isn't the point, I guess.
It's certainly not the point.
I can cop to that. Yeah.
I don't know which instrument Joe or Kyle play, but
I believe Joe is a trumpeter. I'm not sure about Kyle.
Yeah, I know Joe has his own band on Spotify. We'll hopefully get into that in the future, possibly even with an interview or something. But I also want to call attention to the very opening page of the book is the kind of the full single page splash of him walking into town for the evening. And it's just stunningly beautiful. And the colors on that give you the whole palette for the entire book, which, like a nighttime sky is never just inky black. It's always purples and blues. Characters doing shady things are always kind of cast in blue, cool tones. And your protagonist or whoever's carrying the torch of jazz is always in the orangish, yellowish, brightish light. So it's just a very cool, I think having the same storytellers is great. Having different artists is also great, but having the colors unifies this into one cohesive book.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so cool, because when you jump to issue 2 and the colors, because the art style is so radically different there, and the color, the presentation of color is so radically different, but yet you're right, the use of it, the function of it, gives you a similar feeling. Here colors are very vibrant, a lot of depth, a lot of shadow, a lot of movement there. It's very dynamic. When you get to issue 2, which in 1928 in Chicago, there's a flatness to the color intentionally. There's kind of a mutedness. It feels kind of very drab and kind of washed out, because that's what we've come to associate with like Depression era America in terms of how we think of it. So the presentation,
although 28 is still booming. The roaring.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
But after the Depression, it gets really bleak.
When we think of that era of society, we give it that kind of like lens filter almost, but yet the way that colors are used in terms of when the cool tones are used and when the warm tones are used, they're all very similar. And it very much is when the music is playing, when jazz is happening, there are reds and oranges and yellows, and it's very warm and bright. And then the rest of life, as our characters move through it, is when the coolness comes in. Those blues and purples and indigos and all that. And that's our contrast of kind of inside and outside, as it were. And I think that's that consistency throughout the book. I think that's really, really cool, because then at that point, it doesn't matter what style you go with. And we get some wild art styles, wild swings in art styles, which is totally intentional. I
assume you're talking about number 5 in particular, but
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Juni Ba's work.
It makes perfect sense, though, in that era with what's happening with those characters.
Yeah.
But you're right. The fact that they had one colorist color all these radically different artists, some of it whom, when they do their work, are typically colored themselves. A lot of the artists they that contributed here often color their own work. It's what they're used to. So bringing someone from the outside to keep some level of consistency, I think that is really, really, really cool. And it gives you that kind of background consistency that kind of less overt. It's incredibly subtle that you may not even realize it, because the actual line work is so radically different that it'll seem like it's unconnected, but it won't feel that way, and you may not know why. And I think a lot of that comes down to the use of color.
I totally agree. The yellow wash over that is very "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" Which
it is too. Oh yeah.
Yeah. We're kind of soft pivoting to issue 2, so I was like, let's just just say I was getting "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?"
It has that sepia tone on everything.
Right. I remember, this was back in the days of physical media, which I know some of us haven't left, but A Brother, Where Art Thou has always been I don't know. It's like a top 20, 30 movie for me. It's not a top 10, but it is like a warm blanket of comfort. I've always
incredibly rewatchable.
Incredibly rewatchable. Amazing cast. Certainly I think George Clooney's best work ever.
It may be my is it my favorite Clooney performance? It might be.
So but anyway, I remember watching the special features on the DVD because it was 3 a.m. and I was 19, and the movie was over. So it's like, well, I'm not going to get up, and I have a remote, and there was no streaming back then. So what you did is you watched the special features on the DVD, which now is stuff that you only maybe catch on YouTube if you're like going way out of your way for it. But anyway, enough waxing nostalgic about the good old days of DVDs and features. But the director was talking with the cinematographer in an interview about how he, like, the amount of yellow he wanted overlaid digitally on the entire film. They thought he was just bonkers. And I can't remember which one of them, it was like their idea. And they show you, like, here's what the original actual film looked like. And here's after the filter. And it's like, oh my gosh, that is really saturated. But you don't notice it when everything's that way.
Yeah.
When the whole movie is shot that way, it doesn't stand out quite as much. And you kind of accept it as normal, which is what I was getting from, like, you know, issue 1, like, you know, people's skin and clothes and stuff appear like purple and orange. And you're like, wait, none of these are real colors, but the whole thing feels real because he's set, he's so effectively set a palette, which we did get a reply. I don't like making promises I can't keep during recordings, but Igor Monti did reply to us and is interested in coming on the podcast. So we'll see if that can happen. But I think we'd have a lot to talk about there.
I think that'd be fascinating.
Perhaps more so than with any other colorists we talked about. Yeah. And there are a lot of colorists I would love to talk to.
Yeah, but I do think a project like this is fascinating when you're dealing across 6 different artists. And you're right, though, in that the color palette that's set is used throughout, but the way it's used, the way it's deployed throughout the whole series, it's kind of ingenious in that the way it morphs and adapts to each style in each era. But yet, you're right, the feel is always the same. You know, nothing feels out of place because you've been in it the whole time.
Yeah, it's immaculate vibes all the way through. And Gail's story is one that is very, very interesting to me. I felt like this story, Gail Geldstein, issue 2, my first vibe was like, okay, this is like them staying in their lane a little bit more. This is like a white person discovering jazz.
Yeah.
And then immediately being like, oh, I'm going to take it and I'm going to be the best at it. And it's like, oh, no, that's bad. Don't say that. Initially, very offensively says like, I'm going to make the best jazz song in the history of the world because white people in the 1920s, not limited to the 1920s, but certainly in the roaring 20s, were all about the superlatives. It's like,
yes,
I'm not going to get rich. I'm going to be the richest. This is the Horatio Alger generation of Americans. So, of course she would think that way. Of course that's where her mind went. And she like comes back chastened and like learns from that experience.
Yes.
In I think a way that is helpful. You still cringe when she does it. Or at least I really cringed. I was like, oh, please don't say, I'm like, don't say the quiet part.
Yeah, it's not great. But again, I think
there is real.
It is. And I do think there is obviously specific intent that the fact that she's a woman, that she does end up writing one great song and no one knows about it. No one knows it's her. Because, you know, because she has no other recourse, so she has to sell this one great song, and she gets nothing for it, you know. And there's no recognition for her. So there is a kind of a weird stand-in for, again, this white woman in the 20s as an interloper into jazz, but also feeling kind of the pain of being ignored, you know, similar, being kind of lost to history. You know, I think because what we should mention, of course, from the big connective tissue we should mention out of issue 1 is that our main character, Ace Stewart, writes a song. He creates a song which he calls, the Ace High Stomp, and that is kind of the germ of an idea, and that'll kind of bleed its way through. And but he's a name that ends up getting lost to history as well up until the end, because here in issue 2, Gail she meets Leonard Jones, Leo Jones, this jazz pianist who becomes a major figure throughout the rest of the series in terms of what his influence was going forward. And this like quick recording session that we saw kind of take place in this issue, and Gail mentioning seeing someone play when her family was on the vaudeville circuit, seeing someone play and being captivated by a single note. And we see that person as a clarinetist. And we're not told that that's Ace Stewart, but I think you're supposed to believe that it is because of that song and what she's hearing and how that affects people and passes down. So that's kind of your first little sign of connectivity here. And you may not even realize it. And whether or not you know that's Ace Stewart or it's supposed to be, it actually doesn't really matter. You know?
Yeah,
But
no, it completely doesn't matter, but you're starting to feel the flow of the story because of that.
yeah. And here we are in 1928. So you start doing the math a little bit. You're like, okay, well, first story was 1917, and he might have been, Ace might have been like 15, 17, 16 years old at that point, right? So here we're talking about a decade later. We know he got a job, got a gig. He's going to be touring. So 10 years later, he's in his late 20s now. And yeah, of course he's going to be, the world is a little different. Jazz is a bigger thing. It makes sense that he'd be playing some of these venues, So when you actually start putting a timeline together, you realize that these things actually do make sense and that they did take the time to plausibly lay out where all these characters might be as we move through the decades, which, it wasn't haphazard. They weren't like, oh, let's just throw this in here. Everything was very much considered. And again, you don't have to recognize that. You don't have to see that to enjoy the story. You can just read this story about this one character, this one time, in this one place. But when you do really dig into it, you see how considered and how kind of meticulous they laid out all the individual characters and timelines and places, how much work they put in to put it all together, so they could then disperse it out and sprinkle it in whenever they need to.
Yeah, I said this in the Zero as well, that I confidently believe you can go pick up any spot issue of this, except for maybe 6, and just give it to someone on the street. Give it to a comic reader, and the standalone nature of each issue is sufficient. And I think there
definitely
are other anthologies where that's less true. Like, I would give the one-page horror story Ice Cream Man to anyone to read.
Mm-hmm.
Regular Ice Cream Man, I might be a little more selective. Just like issues 1 through 42 or 44 onward.
Yeah.
It's like, it helps to like kind of set up, what is this thing?
Yeah, and I think
this book doesn't need that. Every story tells you exactly what it is.
I think something like Swan Songs, you could obviously give someone one of those issues and just tell them what it's about. But I think there's a greater idea of being like, here's 6 variations on a theme versus here's one issue.
Yes.
I think it can work either way. And I think you're right here that you can, each individual here of Deep Cuts, you're right, is a specific time and a place. So there's an era tied specifically to wherever jazz was in the country at that time and that place. So you get a full story about a character or characters, I guess, depending on what it is, in that time, in that place, and you get a full story. And all the connective bits and all that, like, doesn't really matter. Quick little flash forward, like in issue 4, when we're following our main character there, Dorian, it doesn't matter that at some point when he comes out of prison, he meets a young saxophone player, like a young kid, named I'm lost his name here. Oh, he meets a young kid named Barry, a young saxophone player named Barry. All that matters is he met the next generation. This is the next guy who's living in the same apartment that they used to live in. Back in the day when all the musicians gathered in one apartment, and this apartment got passed down through the generations to the next musician. That's what matters to that story. The fact that Barry then shows up in issue 6 later, fronting his own band, those things, that's a cool thing there, but it doesn't matter for issue 4's story. All that matters is this thing has been passed down, and musicians still use it as a place the way that they started it. So it works entirely self-contained in that moment of telling the story of that place, that time, that character. And any tissue after the fact is just like, that's just dressing on top.
I agree. Yeah. And frankly, some of the connections, I think we had different reactions to issue 6. Like, I didn't need it. Like, I don't need the connections. I was so happy with the way this was going as like just vague hints at the connection.
And you
It
know
doesn't
what?
mean it's bad.
No. I think that's entirely fair. Whenever it can be tricky when these things are laid explicit. I think the reason it worked for me here is that the connections were being made by the characters as well. It wasn't just explained to the reader. That it was character and story important, that the people in it recognize the lineage, that the musicians
I think that's a good. Yeah, and that's a very good point.
Yeah, because
okay.
In
We'll save
general,
the rest for when we get to 6.
But in general, I'm with you that anytime you have these Easter eggs sprinkled throughout a story that you want readers to connect with, and then you get to the end and you connect all the dots.
You're like, please give me credit for all of this.
Yes. It can be seen as, look how clever I am, or look how clever we are. And I tend to, that can be tricky. 100% agree with you. But I think because it's in character, I think that's what matters here. So we'll get there in 6 there. But, jumping back to issue 2, where we started this conversation here, this sidetrack, we should mention Helena Marsellis, who is the artist on this one. And again, we mentioned last week, it's possible this is like her only interior work or significant interior artwork, like actual sequential paneling.
Yeah,
and all that.
I believe she or they, I don't know pronounce, but I believe she lives in Italy.
Yeah, and
so this is all remote, but man.
It's a lot of covers for her, and her style. I think the way she has character. Again, there is something you're like, oh yeah, that's 1920s era. This is Chicago era jazz, right? These are something about it evokes what we think that time period looks like, which I think is really cool and well done. But yeah. The important thing here, story-wise, is we mentioned her one great song, her one great jazz song, right?
Yes, the one that breaks through at the end of the issue, but then you realize in issue 6, like, oh my God, she had a whole library of unpublished music.
Yeah.
Surely someone will, even if they just pick it up and say like, that's a good template, let's go from there and riff off of it. She may end up becoming a huge legend.
Yeah.
Well, what I loved here is, once she leaves the theater and she's going back to, is it Kansas City or is she going?
She's going back. She's going back to Chicago.
Right.
She's in New York because she has a show opening on Broadway.
Right.
It's in the works, and she's going back to Chicago.
Yeah. So the whole issue is very bland. She's on the train, arrives in Chicago, is your first bright page.
Yes.
Which is like, this is where the muse is. And you'll notice that, when the kid's running home in the first issue and it's nighttime, his whole neighborhood, all other people, the front porch, the house, everything, purples, darks, but he's got the muse. He's inspired by the music, by the setting, and he's glowing orange. If she's not wearing her glowing orange coat, then her hat is also off, and her hair is the glowing orange color, very similar to the first. So it's like there is this here's the torchbearer of jazz in this issue.
Oh yeah.
It's a very cool way to pass the baton without making a big meal of it.
And I think again this goes through when when she meets with that old friend who runs the recording studio, and they go into to the club, and there's music playing, and there is a warmth there. It's very white, though. It's very white jazz, as we'll call it, right? And then they go to the telephone booth, and they go to the secret, jazz club, and there again you get those deep reds, those bright reds, the warmth, which is again that signifies this is where the music's at. And then when you come out of that and you're back on the street, you're back to these cool colors, these cool tones. But anytime you're there with the music, you get those warm colors again. And again, the way the colors are used to, the way they're physically presented on the page is totally different than issue 1.
Right.
But you get the same feel.
Yeah, it's incredible. That's why I would so love to talk colors.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
this is a book that if you're not paying attention to the story, you still like. This is both an experience in discovering new art, new artists, new styles, new approaches to the same type of scripts. Like, I doubt that Kyle and Joe's scripts looked radically different for each story, yet the art is very different across each story. And I think that's just one of the amazing things about comics is you could give the same script to 6 artists and they're going to give you 6 totally different things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
And
again,
you've got it right in front of you. So you can learn about art. You can learn about comics. You can actually learn about jazz here, even though these are fictional stories. They are all like loosely based on real-ish events.
I was going to say they're representative.
Yes. That's a better way to say it.
Is there someone named Ace Stewart who played clarinet as a kid in New Orleans? Probably, definitely not. But are there 100 Ace Stewarts who came out of there that have a story like that, who wrote a song, and it got, and they're lost to time because of when and where they played? Absolutely. How many Gail Geldsteins are there from that era? There are probably a ton who are lost to history, who wrote music, who wrote songs and had to give them away and don't have the rights to them, all of that. So you get, I think, as I mentioned this last week during the Zero, you get this like 30,000 foot view of the history of jazz as a kind of parallel path of the history of America. And each one of these stories just kind of drops you in and you get a sense of what was going on at that time period. And then it is up to you, the reader, if that time, that character, that archetype, that kind of archetypical character, if that story trope from that time period, if that grabs you, you have an in to try and go down a further rabbit hole
what they were riffing off of.
Yeah. Exactly, on your own, looking up who what not. So it's not like who was the real Gail Geldstein. It was who was a Gail Goldstein, and you go down that rabbit hole. Who was someone like this? Who does she represent in the world? And maybe not even a one-to-one, like, it's possible probably that these are amalgamations of various characters, and you can go down all these rabbit holes and through that you can educate yourself on all these various eras of jazz, Yeah, you can get there through all of them. So
by the way, I got a new my wife is pregnant and I got a new drink order for her from this book or from this issue. When he goes and orders a lime Ricky at the bar, I was like, what in the hell is a lime Ricky? So I Googled it, and this is Prohibition era, and it's just lime juice, simple syrup, and seltzer water with lime wedges. And I was like, all right, that actually sounds pretty great if you're pregnant in the summer in Cincinnati.
Isn't that
just an ice cold drink? It's a gin and tonic. It's a virgin gin and tonic, basically.
Yeah.
But it's seltzer water instead of tonic.
Yeah.
But yeah, the simple syrup, and you get a little sweetness to counteract the tartness. And I was like,
that's like limeade.
It's it's limeade.
That's like a limeade. Yeah.
Right. Except with
maybe
the
not
simple
quite
syrup,
as sweet.
You don't get all the gritty stuff that like lemonade and limeade can have. So. But yeah, I was like, but it sounds okay. But like, if I made her a limeade, that's lame. If I make her a lime Ricky,
that's true. That
like,
sounds
impressive.
Really, sounds impressive. I do love. I personally
big wife guy energy.
Very much so. Very much so. Yeah. Good job there. So at the end of this issue, we say that we have moved forward in time a little bit, and it jumps to Kansas City in 1940, right? And then we see where Gail's song "I'm Just Here for the Music" has led to, and we see that it's been recorded by a band leader named Baron Redman. Right. And saying like, hey, it doesn't matter who wrote, and we see some guys talking like, hey, who wrote the song? Hey, it doesn't matter. It's the Baron's song now. And it's that sort of idea of the forgotten composer, like,
I mean, it's a little like when people try to impress you with the trivia of like, oh, Bob Dylan actually wrote All Along the Watchtower. It's like, but that's Jimi Hendrix's song now.
Yeah.
And he
Dolly
wasn't
Parton
doing
I
a
Will
Bob
Always
Dylan
Love You.
cover. It was a Jimi Hendrix song. The lyrics sound like Jimi Hendrix lyrics.
Yeah.
And yet, if you go listen to the John Wesley Harding album, Dylan's version fits perfectly with his album thematically. But yeah, it was just one of those things where I won like a lightning round trivia at a bar one time for knowing it was a Bob Dylan song, and they were like shocked that I knew that instantly. And I was like, well, first of all, a million people cover that song.
I was like,
it's also like a big Dave Matthews. Like,
I was like, I thought that was very much a thing that people knew. But so there that is the passing of the torch here from issue 2 to issue 3, because issue 3 jumps into Kansas City in 1940, and we're following our next character, or at least set of characters here, which is Otis Leslie, who's a bass player, or at least former bass player, and his young daughter Alice, and we're kind of making our way through the scene at this time as Otis is him and his wife are juggling parenting duties. They talk about like shift change, where one's working days, one working nights, and they're just going back and forth. And you can tell Otis still has this pull of playing of playing music. That every once in a while, maybe he's playing the bass a little at home, and he gets a little taste of it,
And his daughter wants that for him.
Yes,
like she was like, I know this will make him happy, and you can tell for him.
Well, also you can tell she's drawn to it herself, not just for her father, but there's something about it that she is drawn to music as well. Yeah, and there's that tie between them that she's just beginning and kind of just nurturing, but you can see him, in terms of scratching this itch a little bit, but never going, he's in his living room playing a little bit here and there. And then all of a sudden he gets an opportunity to go play, and he sits in on a jam session. And then, oh, lo and behold, who shows up? Baron Redman, the guy we just met at the end of issue 2. And he gets an opportunity to go on the road again, which is something he was doing before he had a family, before he met his wife, before he had his kids. And he has the opportunity, and he jumps at it initially, because like this is the chance to go back out there. And then when he has a chance to kind of sit in it and think about it, he's like, you know what? Different time, different life. That isn't who I am anymore. But we see at the very end, he's pretty good at fixing stuff, right? He fixes that one guy's baritone sax, and as they jam a little, we see his daughter Alice on the piano. So we see this passing of the torch a little of he doesn't need to be on the road and touring to be connected to the music. He can still be in it and be around it and be a part of it, while still being at home, being with his family, and being with his wife and raising his daughters. So I like the journey that Otis goes through in this particular issue. The thing with but
he's almost the passenger. I mean, I think that his daughter is the storyteller here.
It is, yeah.
Even though we follow places she doesn't go.
Yes, yeah. But so much of it is seen through her perspective in terms of how she sees her parents, specifically how she sees her father, this idea of the investigators, the PI, she's trying to figure out what her father's past was and all that.
Yeah, the thing that jumped out at me, this is probably not surprising that in my notes, I had, we talked about the underwater welder right as I was about to have my first child, and the comp that always comes to me with parents who have things they're passionate about, like music or whatever, and then having a kid, and everyone tells you like, oh, this is the most important thing you'll ever do. And it's like, I think of Toby Ziegler in The West Wing right before his twins were born. And he was like, look, I like what's important to me. Like, I don't want the things I care about right now to feel unimportant in comparison. And I don't want to sound like a bad parent for saying that. Like, what do I do with this tension? And I think this is like that 5 years later, where like, I think he genuinely is very happy as a father.
100%. But you can tell he loves music, and he still plays, and he's trying to figure out he doesn't want to go one or the other. I think you can see it, Otis. He's trying to figure out how to meld these two. And when he gets a chance to play again, he's still working this out. He jumps at it because he thinks this is what I can do. I can show my kids that, I'm playing and going on the road. But said once he has a little while, like a day or so to really sit on and think on it, he realizes, no, that's not the case at all. That wouldn't solve the issue. That wouldn't fix anything here. And so he's able to come.
But it helped to know that he still could find value and is valued in that community. Like, I think he needed the affirmation more than anything.
That's a good point. I think I hadn't thought about that until you just said it. He's playing at home. You can see he's still in it, but getting that one moment, getting to jam with them, getting to be a part of the group, and then having a respected musician come and be like, hey, I like you. You're good. I want you on my tour. You're right. Getting that affirmation, I think, was enough for him. It was like, I had my moment again, and that was enough, because what I have now with my family, with my wife and my kids, this stability is what I want. Yeah. But again, he does find a way to pass this down, to stay in the music and be a part of it and have his two worlds merge, as opposed to being like a before and an after thing.
I mean, I gotta tell you, that's all I'm trying to do as a parent. And like, I feel funny saying it, but like, I'm like, I want her to be able to into whatever she's into, but also as long as, anything she wants, as long as it's guitar and comics.
Yeah. You can have any hobby you want as long as they're daddy's hobbies.
Right. As long as I'm like, I was like, let's just say what we're saying here. But like, I want to be able to support whatever she happens to get into.
Yeah.
It would bring me so much joy to have this common bonding point.
Yes.
But it's not her job to pick up my hobbies. It is my job to get interested in whatever she's interested in.
Yes.
Which is why I've seen Mary Poppins 100 times in the last year. A movie that I didn't even really connect with that much as a child. But for some reason, my daughter latched onto it, and I was like, I will sit and watch as many times as you want to watch. Which, and then it was Aristocats, and now it's Frozen 2. So it's just a whole bunch of stuff I was never into.
Yeah. Well, and you know what? And we see that here because, we're watching Alice as she's watching her father, right? Trying to figure out what his past was and all that. And we see that.
When I love the Squeaky Boys angle of it all. Like, the fact that her mind can come up with all of these scenarios are frankly unnecessary, but that's what kids do.
Yeah. But we see that Otis also sees it, because when he's, sneaking out for that gig, he hands her a magnifying glass, which obviously doesn't make any sense for what's happening here, but it's a visual representation of, like, I see what you're doing. I see you and this inquisitive nature, this idea. And so he gives her a specific token so that he understands what she is kind of doing here, and yet, it leads to him again, going out, having this night and this realization about his music. But yeah, there is again, this idea of bridging generations and how this music can do that. And, I really did love this story there, because I think you're right. There's a lot of real feelings, a lot of real realizations about life and how family and career and all these things can change, and how it's not perfect. And wanting one thing doesn't mean you automatically no longer want the other, and vice versa. And that it's not a binary situation, and wanting this thing in lieu or with the other thing doesn't make you a bad person.
Yeah.
Doesn't make you cold and calculated. Yeah.
No, in fact, I think it's what makes you a person.
I would agree. Yes.
Because I think
that struggle of I'm trying. And I think we see this with Otis, that he's trying to find a way to merge these things together, because he understands that he loves his family, loves his wife, loves his kids, but that doesn't mean he has to stop loving music. It doesn't mean he has to stop playing it, and making that sacrifice isn't noble. There's nothing great about I'm denying this thing because I'm committed to my there's nothing noble about that. that there's
Right.
a way that these things can intertwine and they can come together. It just takes a little while to figure out. And I think that's the journey that Otis goes on. And said, in the end, you have this like mini jam session in the house, which again, very important that we see Alice on the piano, because again, that is the passing down. And I think that's where Otis starts seeing how the music can continue, how this thing can keep going, is he can pass it down through his daughter, and that's how it'll live on, and that's enough for him.
Yeah. And for a lot of parents, I think that is the dream, is like just to have any shared interest. And that's like, that's for a lot of like parent children, it's like sports or something like that.
Yeah. But
if you're a musician and you have to give up your music,
yep.
I can't think of anything more rewarding than what he gets here, which is, and I think there's still that hope that once life calms down, once she's a little bit older, once their house isn't constantly making all these sounds, because I think that was like, he's longing to hear the sound of music, and instead at the beginning you're getting all of these eerie like creaks and stuff like that, and it's like, is this a horror story? And then it's like, that's a furnace.
That's right. There is a subplot like, with the furnace, which
but you don't know for like 10 pages. It's just, but it's just happening in the background. And it's like, oh, he would love to hear the sound of music, but what he hears instead is the sound of the calls of everyday life, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, you can fix this, you can fix this. Also, him cleaning the gutters is like my favorite page of comics. Like the paneling on that. I don't know why. It's just so. It's so great. It's like, how do you have fun with the artist saying, or the writer saying, and here he's going to stand on a ladder and clean gutters, but they're able to crop it into 3 uneven panels that are time lapses, and yet the whole width, if the crop wasn't there, it's one consistent picture of the house.
And we should mention that the artist here, Diego Greco. In a way, this is they separate it through panels, but that's a common trope of comics. It's a form of what's called the DeLuca effect, where static image, but you have multiple versions of the character moving through time throughout the page,
right?
As a way to show movement. Oftentimes it's done in a big splash page. Pick up any book, quite literally pick up any book written by Kelly Thompson. Doesn't matter what artist she's working with. There's going to be some sort of really, really awesome DeLuca page effect, especially in superhero comics, because she loves writing those scenes as the heroes are moving through a group of like 24 people to beat up. Whether it's Birds of Prey, Hawkeye, Black Widow, anything like that, you get that same kind of. It's like time lapse, basically, on a static image. And so you're right, getting that image here, and the fact that the panels aren't equal size,
right,
is such an interesting, curious choice.
But I think it's depicting the amount of time, right? Like him climbing down the ladder takes the smallest increment.
Well, no. Interesting. I saw it as. See how much of the gutters he cleared in the first panel is a lot, and then the middle one he stops halfway through, and then
interesting. Okay,
so I saw it in terms of how long he spent cleaning, and then at the end he just gave up and went back inside and picked up his bass.
Fair enough. Yeah, well, that's definitely also happening, but I thought it was a time lapse of like, here's the biggest chunk of time.
Well,
him actually cleaning it. The smallest chunk is he gives up and gets down.
He gives up, and then
carrying the ladder off takes a little more time than climbing down from the ladder.
Yeah. But it is. But you're right. It is a visual trick to depict time through static images on a page.
Yeah. Well, and I guess I haven't read Kelly Thompson, but I know. I obviously I'm not going to name anyone, but I think lesser artists will do the same thing, but they will kind of redraw the house each time, or they'll like crop in, and it doesn't work if you zoom out to have one consistent thing. I think
Well,
that's
I mean,
standard motion and comedy. That's not DeLuca, but it's
yeah, that's it. There are dozens of ways to depict this exact same idea and to get the same thing across. This idea of him having to do this mundane task and then him bailing on it so he can go back inside and pick up his bass. You know, that's what's important here, is that he has a thing he has to do and he's doing it. He's doing it mostly well. And then he just gives up because he wants to go do the thing he wants to do. And so there are so many ways artists can interpret that and put it on page. And you're right, some are better than others, and that comes down to who the artist is and I think their skill at storytelling. But I don't necessarily think one is better than the other. But this approach here, I think, works so well, especially when it's wordless and you're just seeing actions. You know, you understand the character and his motivation. So when you see him again on the next line and he's got a big smile on his face and he's got the bass there, and you know that the last time we saw him, he was up on a ladder cleaning out gutters. You know,
right.
You get a sense of what his mindset is and what his mindset was as he moved through those panels with the house being there, you know? So just multiple ways to get to the same kind of end. And I think the way that Greco went about it here, I think it's perfectly fitting for the character.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And this one has like some of this. I mean, I assume working digitally art on this one, because some of the blurring and stuff from like foreground and background is very cinematic, but I just don't know how you would do that.
And what I will say here is we've talked about what the collision is of colors, the coolness versus the brightness.
Yeah.
And I think when you start looking at this book, a lot of the themes continue where obviously it's set in wintertime. So anything outside is kind of cool and white and bluish and all that. But anytime you see the music in the past, it has that warmer sheen to it. But I think the thing you actually notice is the warmest colors are when he's with his wife and his kids.
When they're all three in the room.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
It gets sometimes it's a little warm when just his daughter's there, and when all three of them and the baby are together,
but
it's like bright red.
But initially you think that maybe it's there because the bass is in the room. You know,
right.
You think it's around the music, but in this case,
or if you're reading it without the context of the other stories and their coloring, you might think like, oh, he's kind of triggered, he's on edge, he's getting angry.
Yeah,
maybe that's what red means.
Yeah. Because I'm at the end here. We talked about the magnifying glass moment there, and when his wife comes home and he gives her kind of the lie about, oh, I gotta step out with my bass a little bit, like there's something with the tuning pegs. There's a real brightness and warmness there. And then when we cut to the jam session, it's very normal. It's very kind of plain, you know? It doesn't have that brightness to it, that warmness that we've seen in the previous issues. You know, it's just kind of a scene, you know? And in that way it stands out. And then when he comes home and the argument with his wife, there it's very, very cool. It's very, very icy, you know, and we see that through up until the end when he comes back. And then there's this kind of reconciliation and understanding about life when you get that warmness again, you get those brightness, that kind of fullness when you have the merging of family and music now, you know? And so that journey for this specific issue, I think, is really cool.
Yeah, definitely very cool. This is I don't have them ranked. I think I have a favorite and a least favorite, but this is very near the top. You know, I think maybe even if this issue had come first and been the palette, set the palette for the rest of them, it might be my favorite. But I think I have a lot of attachment to one, but also I've had issue one for so long now because the series took so long to come out. Yeah. That I reread issue one a few times.
Multiple times getting ready for it.
So I think I felt the most connection to that one. But let's go to issue 4, which is Blue Notes, New York City, 1956.
Yeah, 1956.
Let me tell you what I wrote.
Ramon Perez, real quick, as the artist here. So.
Yes. Yeah. So what I'm about to say has nothing to do with Ramon Perez. In theory, this would be my favorite issue in the series. Like, storytelling things it tries to do.
Okay. Say based on storytelling or based on like era of music. Okay.
No, storytelling, setting, and message. Like I think the idea that it's the tragic story of the trumpet player who never made it because of mandatory minimums and him being a good dude and trying to take one for his buddy, thinking like, oh, I don't have a record, so I'll be fine. Yeah. Instead, he gets 3 years in prison, and that sets him back, gives him bad habits, gets him involved in stuff he shouldn't be involved in. But all of that stuff.
But he also has dependency issues. Like he has struggles.
Sure. But those things are made no better in prison. Like,
definitely not. Yeah.
Well, there's no reforming or anything in our prisons. It's just punitive. But so in theory, however, what I love about anthologies is there is the singular focus on A stories. Like you're not getting a lot of runners and B plots in anthologies because each issue is just one story and usually this. However, this story, the way it was executed, the way it came off to me, felt like watching 3 or 4 runners tied together, like without an A plot. It felt just a little convoluted to the point where I was like, I'm not sure I can even tell until the very end who the subject is.
I have something very similar written down in that when I first read this, I think I had to read this issue a couple times. Like you read through the first time and you kind of get it, but a lot of things felt lost to me. I had to read this issue a couple times through to really, I needed to know where it ended to help me in the beginning and see, because you have to.
And I don't mind reaching for something, and I don't think you do either. That's not what we're saying.
But I do think this issue, because as we say, the main timeline, the quote unquote present timeline, is New York 1956. That's when our character Dorian Emos.
That's all you. I'm
putting it EMMAUS Emos. I don't know, our trumpet player. That's the time.
Yeah, it's got to be Emos.
1956. That's when he records this one great album and then ultimately passes away. But we jump back so often in between 1956 and again 1940. We don't jump until before the previous issue. So we have all this time going back and forth, and because it's told in this narrative flashback way, I'm with you. There is something a little confusing about it. It is a little convoluted, and having to I think you do actually have to keep track of when each of these kind of vignettes happen, when he meets certain people and things like that. And that's more work than the other issues in this series ask you to do. And oftentimes it isn't when stories do that in anthologies, it's often not super important. What you're supposed to understand is that, we're jumping through time here, the order of things, not so much. You'll pick it up as you go with what's happening with the characters. I do think in this issue, it matters that you pay attention it matters a little more heavily of when the character is, because of the things that Dorian is experiencing and what he's dealing with, like with his synesthesia and eventual kind of drug abuse and things like that. You have to have an understanding of where he is in his life and who he's interacting with and who these people are. And when they're talking from whatever this memorial piece after his death, you have to know what their perspective is. And it takes a little while. I think one read through for me was like, I didn't quite get that. Now, like I got to put some thought into this one.
I completely agree with you, but I also think you get the vibe, like you get the message of it from one read through.
Yes.
That comes,
but I felt I was missing a lot of context.
Oh my God! Yeah, so was I. Which is why I kept rereading and rereading and rereading, and I was I was like looking at League of Comic Geeks discussions on this issue, just to like see how it was hitting people, because I felt like I think all the ingredients there just didn't quite come together the way I wanted it to, and I think. I don't know. I'm like, I can't think of a better way to arrange it given what they were trying to do.
Yes. I think it comes down to initial approach. I
think the initial approach is just too convoluted for a one-off anthology story.
Maybe so. The idea of, although
but it's cool.
what it led to were some incredible art panels, like before you know what's happening, but when you have the interview panels, like if this were a documentary, right? You talk to the
Right.
you move to the talking head, the black and white
sketches.
The hand hatching all the way through, and then when you get to the end and you realize that like these are people who were maybe, or speaking after the fact or at his memorial service, and you get what that time frame is, and those pieces come together, and then the hard contrast of that with the I guess not flat, I don't know, of Dorian's actual story, right? And what Ramon's artwork is, Ramon Perez's artwork is, it is so radically different from that hand-drawn black and white stuff. The way it's colored, the way he uses hatching, or actually he doesn't in a lot of his characters. His character work is pretty smooth, pretty simple. His line work is pretty sparse. But you get that hard contrast. And I think that idea is really cool. That presentation is really awesome. But I'm with you.
Like,
I'm with you
Ramon
there.
Perez crushed it.
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
100 out of 100.
Yeah.
Like
And
full marks on the
I
art
do think,
and the colors.
Well, this is the most overt in terms of the when the colors change, what does it mean? And I'm obviously some of that is the fact that we have our character Dorian Emas here who has synesthesia and doesn't really know it. He doesn't understand why he's seeing all these colors. He thinks he's going mad. He thinks he's going crazy. So it's literalized for one of the characters, but to the reader, it's so blatantly obvious that when he's on the street, I love early on. God, it's earlier than I thought. It's like the second page when he is walking into the club and everything is in blues and purples, and yet he's in this like bright yellow suit. And as he walks through, you have these incredible panels, vertical panels cut through. And as he walks closer and closer into the club, into the stage, the colors get warmer and warmer, and then we have a flashback page, and then we cut to the performance, and then it's all these reds and pinks and yellows and this beautiful this beautiful warmth, like a fire kind of you drawn to. And it's right. It's just, it's more explicit here. The color contrast than I think in any issues before. So if you hadn't caught on to that visual cue, hopefully it's pretty obvious here for you.
Yeah, and I think this one is the other possible exception to, my, you could just buy any issue of this and give it to anyone. However, I also think it has, initially anyway, the least connective tissue to the other ones. This feels like the true standalone story, but of course we learn it is not.
Yeah, but I think you can too, because I think there are a lot of parallels here. It feels like there are parallels to, in my mind, specifically Charlie Parker's life. Although we have our trumpet player here, Dorian, he's a great performer, but he only makes the one great record. Charlie Parker, obviously, much more accomplished, much more known.
Beat him by a couple.
Yeah, but the idea of incredible talent, had his demons, had substance abuse issues, and there is the story that when Charlie Parker died, he was like in his 30s or whatever, and like the autopsy identified him as someone like 25, 30 years older than he actually was, because his body was so wrecked. And so this idea that almost like a ticking clock, you're running out of time and you have to get out everything you can. So I think there are, it feels like there's some connection, some quasi parallel. So you could give, I think, someone just this story and you can just follow the tragic arc of Dorian Emas, and I think it still works, because you don't have to know about Leo Jones and when that name is dropped and the song he sings called a sigh. You don't have to know these connections. You don't have to pick up, again, like I said, that the young saxophone player that he meets when Dorian comes out of jail. You don't have to know that guy is Barry Newark and he's going to show up later. All you get a self-contained story here. It's a tragic one. It's a sad one, but there is ultimately, I think what we talked about earlier, that it's not it's not optimistic so much, but there is a hopefulness to the
Yeah.
story, because things aren't always rosy and happy, but there is that idea at the end of when all of our characters are at his funeral memorial, right? And we have again this white guy, long hair, glasses, a scraggly beard, this Hudson Lowell that we meet, we don't know his connection to, shows up in the next issue, spoiler alert, but at the he says like, man, what a tragedy, they only got one record from Dorian Emus. And then another guy jumps in, and what a miracle. Think of all that dedication,
Right.
all the personal demons he conquered, the belief in us. So it still ends on this uplifting note that, yes, it's terrible that we only got one thing from this genius. But then when you think about everything he was going through, the fact that you got one is incredible in its own right. So you have this mix of the high and the low, of how tragic it is for this character. And again, stand-in representative for a lot of people, a lot of musicians, without question, from that era. But then there is this sense of something gets to live on. At least one thing gets to live on, and I think so much of the overall book of Deep Cuts is about legacy and what's passed on. And this is the start of that. The fact that he was able to record this one song written by his friend who had already died, the Roy Milne character. He got to record this one song that his friend wrote for him, that his friend had he had written that song based off of a tune he had got from his mentor, who we know is Leo Jones. And if you're paying attention, we know Leo from issue 2, and the encounter with Gail Geldstern, So if you are picking up on all these things, you can see the track of where we get to the song Acai Berry, right?
Right.
That specific song. If you're not picking up on that, if you just see the this issue for what it is, you don't need to know the specifics, but you do know that that the Roy character got this melody from his mentor, and that he riffed on it and passed it on to his friend, who he felt bad about because he ended up in jail. And his lasting gift was, here's this song. So even if you don't know the specifics, you still know the generality of, here's how we're passing this down. Here's how artists and musicians are riffing on what came before, and what they're calling the counterfactuals, right? That they're not covers. You're not ripping them off. You're taking it and you're molding it, and you're turning it into something new, but you're informed of what came before. And that's the important thing. If you happen to recognize the character names and Easter eggs from come before, all the more better for you, the reader, but you don't have to. It's not critical. It's just it's the extra sprinkle on top, the extra layer of kind of insight that you can get, that is there for you. If you're reading it all, you get that little extra bit.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, I mean, there are countless stories. I was trying to think of like a jazz particularly, but then you get into the discussion of issue 5, which is like, who gets to define what jazz is? The musicians, the critics, the audience, whatever. But
the
it's
existential
like,
questions. Yeah.
But even just talking about music in that 50s, 40s through 60s era, you think like a Sam Cooke died at 33, a Jimi Hendrix at 27, Otis Redding at 26. And that's one where it's like, you look at Otis Redding's library, unbelievable at 26.
Well, isn't there a whole thing in rock about the 27 Club? Like, musicians who died at 27? Like,
oh, sure. Yeah. I was just thinking specifically of
that. Yeah.
Black musicians and
sure,
suspicious circumstances, or,
but
unfortunate circumstances. And then you can even go forward into like, hip hop rap, Tupac at 25, Biggie at 24. It's all like, there are so many tragic stories like this. Yet when I don't know if you listen to any rap at all, but there was this moment where I was thinking of some of the conversations in these 2 issues of issues 4 and 5. Kendrick Lamar's second album, To Pimp a Butterfly, ends with him having an imaginary conversation with Tupac. Like, he took an interview with Tupac, but put his own questions in and it frames Tupac's answers as to like how Kendrick has been influenced by Tupac. And Kendrick, I guess he's old enough to have had some age overlap with them, but was a kid, when Tupac died. And so it was just like a very tangible way to show this connective tissue of like, hey, we're both from Compton, similar stories, but I made it into my 30s. And it was a very cool thing. I was getting a lot of that from these two issues in particular.
I think very much there are parallels there, and I think how you look how the issue ends there with that same kind of sentiment. He's like, we talked about everything he went through, and he's like, it's a vinyl snapshot. How many other geniuses never got that chance? It changes the way you look at things. This idea of you can think about what you never got. You can think about all the music you never got from these artists that died young for whatever reason. But the other way to frame that is you look at what you did get. And if you look at it like you only have a finite amount of time, and you, even though you don't know what the end point is, and in retrospect, you do know that this is all you get. What did you get while that person was here? And even if it's just the one thing, if it's one great thing, like maybe that's enough. And maybe that's all you can take from it. And you can't worry about what you might've gotten because you're never going to get that, and it doesn't just apply to jazz. You're right. It applies to all manner of music, but it is hard to read this. And I 100% think you're right in companion with issue 5. Look at these two together. And there is some connective tissue there in terms of character overlap, which you don't know at the time, but the conversation around the art, because that's what these issues are kind of touching on. 4 and 5 are touching on little less about the music itself and more about how the music is perceived and the conversation around jazz. And I think that's an interesting pivot for the book to make.
I agree. Let me tell you what I wrote for issue 5.
Sure.
And I wrote this, I want to say 5 pages in. I paused and wrote this so that I was like, whatever happens, I want to say what I thought at first, which is, if you take this swing, it's a dangerous gambit to build up a writer like him and then write for him. To write the article at the end of this, after all this hype about what a great writer he is, how well he knows music, you better nail it. Yeah. And I actually think they did, which makes this an incredibly impressive issue.
I agree. I think the art, what we read of the article, is incredibly good. And I wonder, I think,
and it's nothing if you didn't watch him get there, right? If you didn't watch him struggle for it. Yeah. You couldn't have just started with the article and then backwards it showed.
I'm talking in isolation like you were. Like, you just read that and you're thinking, okay, this perspective, whoever wrote it, like this is really, really good. This is insightful. It's deep. It's thoughtful. It's introspective. It has an understanding of the subject matter. So the fact that we build up and we see that Hudson is just like a burnout. It's almost like a wannabe Hunter S. Thompson kind of thing. I don't know if that's entirely what they're going for, but so again, we see him in issue 4 in the 50s in New York. Just over a decade, 12 years earlier. Like he's there outside the club. He's there at the memorial service, and so now we get a little of his backstory. We understand he's a journalist. He's someone that covered jazz, and that he was there, quote unquote, back in the day for, at least in the beginning of this issue, what he feels was like real jazz, and now we get assigned to cover what's happening now in where are we, 1968 specifically. Which is like this kind of experimental off the wall stuff that he doesn't think is real jazz.
Free jazz is the really derivative way he talks about it.
Exactly. Yeah. And in his mind, he's like, I was there in New York in the 50s. I know what real jazz is. And he has this, and because he sees this assignment to cover this artist, Arlo Adler Burns, this wildly
which
free
he says is a name and a sentence, which was a great line.
That's fantastic. But that's punishment to him, And people are like, hey, yeah, but you covered jazz back in the day. And he has this mentality of like, yeah, I covered the real stuff. This isn't real. And so we get his journey depicted in that article, which you're right, is so good. This idea of who gets to define what this is, who gets to say what it is, who gets to pass judgment on it. And then the mere act of doing that is like antithetical to the entire idea of jazz,
Right.
And you're right, it does land to the point that that's almost an academic paper. And I do think it is said, I think somewhere, that Joe Clark, he does teach jazz at Northwestern, whether it's adjunct or whatnot, but like he is someone who approaches the music from both a performance and academic level. So I wonder if writing something like that isn't too far out of his wheelhouse.
I mean, yeah, let me just read what knocked my socks off.
Sure.
Asking what is jazz is really just asking who gets to decide what jazz is. Musicians, listeners, record executives, critics? Ask a pizza chef, a golfer, and a serial killer what the word slice means, and you're going to get three very different answers.
That's so good. That's so good. That's so good.
Oh my gosh. That is worth your $6.99 or $5.99 cover price for the issue right there. And that's not like a great moment in comics that by itself. It's also a great moment in criticism and in art and in all of these other things. And it made me think of there's an essay from Susan Sontag called Against Interpretation. And I've pulled that quote. Mm-hmm. She says, "Today is such a time when the project of interpretation is largely reactionary, stifling, like the fumes of the automobile and of heavy industry which befoul the urban atmosphere. The effusion of interpretations of art today poisons our sensibilities. In a culture whose classical dilemma is the hypertrophy of the intellect at the expense of energy and sensual capability, interpretation is the revenge of the intellectual upon art." Bam. I'm like, I think the Susan Sontag of it all, saying like, so much about criticism, especially art criticism, tells you so much more about the critic than it does the piece.
100%.
And I sent that quote. It just happened to be I sent that quote yesterday because my uncle sent me some film review that he thought was amusing of the new Disney Snow White movie, and like the first three paragraphs is from a BBC article. It's talking about like, this is all the stuff I went into the movie with, which is like, Disney Snow White has been attacked from both sides of the political spectrum. It has been condemned for being too progressive. A Disney princess, renowned for her pale skin, being played by an actress with Colombian heritage. How dare they? And not progressive enough. Caricaturized dwarfs in this day and age. How dare they? And it's like, these are people making the movie about their issue. And I'm not defending Disney's live action reinterpretations of their classic movies because they're bad. And I haven't seen this one. I'm probably not going to see it, but it's bad.
You probably will eventually. You have a daughter.
I hope not.
I think that one's out of your hands there. But yeah, it is the
I have
point.
Parental filters on Disney Plus.
I think regardless of the quality, the subjective quality of the film, I think the point is still right, that you can take this and spin it any way you want, depending on
right. And it says
you can use this as
because
ammo.
You've got your filter.
Yes.
And there are, like, I guess the first side of that criticism was like the anti-DEI side. Mm-hmm. And they're like, how dare they do this, and this? It's supposed to be a white role. It's right there in the name. And it's like, yeah, how many like pieces of media did you comment on today making the exact same point? Because the media itself, you're not even looking at the art. You're looking for something to project your views onto.
Exactly.
And, and that's what this critic has to learn, is like, he's got, there's also the problem of gatekeeping, which like he kind of addresses, but I think he learns like, I don't get to just decide what jazz is and then critique everything based on that from 1958, my first experience. Yeah. My job is to interact with whatever is here.
Yes.
And have a fresh interaction with that. And I mean, I was really impressed when he sat down to do his homework and got out the stack of books, which he wasn't really going to read, but
Yeah.
like pulled the whole vinyl collection. I was like, this is not a hit piece. This is a real writer taking on a real piece, real challenge here.
Yeah, and I think what we're shown is that Hudson, as a journalist, this guy is actually good. He might
He's
be
got chops. Right.
Yeah. He was good and he is good. He does his job. He may be a screw up and he's tripping on acid through a lot of it. Which again is perfect for Juni Ba's style, the way he draws character and environment, all of that. It's so perfect for Juni's style. But you don't get a sense that he's a bad journalist. He might not be a good person. He might be a terrible person to be around and you don't want to invite him to your house for a party, but you do get a sense that he really does care about music and journal. He wants to do that part right. So yeah, even though he thinks it's a crap assignment, he's like, well, regardless of what his motivation is, he's like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do it right. I'm going to dig into it. I'm going to listen to all this. I'm going to get really into the weeds with it. And yeah, it takes a while, but he gets there to that realization of what his, I would say what his job is, like what his position is, what his stance is for it relative to this music,
Yes. Yeah.
And he does get there.
He gets there. He becomes a very interesting character, yada, yada, yada. All that to say, great issue. And they set a very high bar for themselves and then cleared it, which I think is always very impressive.
You're right. It is always tough when you create a character that's supposed to be competent in something that maybe you are not competent in, and then you have to do the thing,
Right.
Like you can't write a character.
You can't write a movie about someone writing like the movie That Thing You Do. They were like,
yes,
if this is going to be a believable story, we actually need a banger of a song.
You're right. If
that people are going to be humming away from the movie theater.
If that song doesn't slap, the movie is dead. That song has to rule. No, it's like you can't create something about people who are really, really funny and then show them and not be funny. Like this is a big problem with Studio 6 on the Sunset Strip.
Yeah, I was like, I already used my Sorkin credit for the day, but I'm glad you saved yours wisely.
Yeah, like there's a lot of good stuff.
They forgot
in that
to bring
show.
the funny.
There's a lot of good stuff in that show about the workplace comedy aspect, the workplace dynamic, something that Sorkin's really good about. But when they actually have to execute at that workplace, like 90% of the skits that you actually see, whether you see them in the show, within the show, or in rehearsal, like they're not actually fun. Like very, very few of them are actually funny. And that's a problem when it's supposed to be a comedy show. The other aspects, the interpersonal stuff, the drama, that's all the stuff that Sorkin's good at.
Right. The commentary on media and everyone's responsibility and everybody needs to eat their vegetables.
But actually writing sketch comedy, not so much. So yeah, you can set yourself up for failure in that way. But I do think that what we read in this article is so good. It's so introspective, and it can be applied to, you're right, to art criticism in general.
All criticism. Like the fact that this writer of this BBC piece said, like, I think there's some Disney princess fatigue, which is just like, I cringe every time someone says there's superhero fatigue. I'm like, no, there's bad movie fatigue, and there's always been bad movie fatigue.
Yeah.
When there's a great superhero movie again, people will be right back on board.
Yeah, like Disney, like what do you like? All you have to do is go.
But that's the critic bringing their lens. The critic is saying, I'm tired of sitting through bad superhero movies. Yeah. Totally fair position for critic to have.
Yeah.
However, you can't go into every movie now that jaded and cynical, because then you're not going to be able to see the movie. You're just going to be able to see like, it's another superhero thing. It's like, right. It doesn't matter if like an origin story is archetypal or something like that. It matters how well it's executed. In and of itself, in isolation of everything else.
Yeah. So,
but anyway, let's get to the final issue here, because we are approaching 2 hours
we're getting
discussion
there,
here. Which
we should say though, at the end, we get this as we get the article, which is entitled "The Great Unknown." by R. Hudson Lowell. That's the name of this piece in Ditch Bug magazine. We get those snippets from the article, and we basically get a montage scene as we move our way through, and we see literally all of our characters. Right, so we are seeing the people that Hudson interacted with. We see Otis and his wife as an elderly couple, and we see Alice at a piano. Right, we see the person we end up knowing is Leo James in France, who was from issue 2. We explicitly get Miss Geldstein. Right, we get an elderly man with a clarinet, which, in a case that I still don't understand, like, is it open and it's upside down with the bell up? I don't know, just to make sure it's a clarinet. But the assumption is that could be Ace Stewart, because it's 1968, right? So that's 51 years from when we saw him in issue 1. And if he's a teenager in that time, he can still be alive, not a problem there, right? And then what we jump ahead and we see all of our we have all of our characters interacting with this article and seeing the words that they've written here, and then we move into issue 6, which is our finale and our literal wrap up for all of our characters.
Yeah, issue 6 was very interesting to me. So first of all, the art is distinct, and some of the panels, and I don't really understand why, are kind of Funhouse Mirror. Just bendy, warpy.
I think that's just Toby Cypress' art style. Yeah. It's similar to Juni Ba in the previous issue, especially the way that Juni draws faces. They're very long and square, like chins and all that. It's just how it's just how he does. I think Toby Cypress is his character design, real long necks. Kind of, it's just his style, and maybe that's to reflect some of the time. Where was it? 1977, right? It's worldwide. We're going throughout. It's that era. He's trying to they're commenting on like this early electronica disco stuff, jazz fusion, jazz rock kind of thing. But I do think it's just the way he draws.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I liked it, but it's not always that way too. I mean, there are normal looking. So I think he has fun with it, especially when they're playing music. They're grooving. Their bodies are literally warping.
I think that may be the case. That
I think it's meant to convey motion rather than
it very well could. Because I do think you're right there.
My bad description of it.
Now that I'm going through it again, it is whenever they're performing. That's when you get those kind of weird angles of people and all that. So I do think it's probably meant to be representative of that.
Yeah. Like I said, this was, I think, the loose tying together of threads that I didn't personally need tied together. That being said, if you're going to do it, I think this is very well done. Because it's not too much of it. It's not so on the nose. It's not obnoxious with it, which it very easily could have been. But yeah, like the choice of characters, the like compromise to sell out, the callback, and the fact that there is this sense of honoring those who came before, like very intentionally embedded into this. Yeah. And again, what makes this one work. And the fact that, like, there's kind of the metaphor of the puzzle. Yes. Sitting on the table halfway through, and he's literally putting puzzle pieces together of all these musics, that he wants to be doing, and he doesn't want to be doing disco, and he's trying to cobble together this new image out of all the pieces left from people who came before. I was like, it's not on the nose. It's very subtle. It's right there, though.
And that's a puzzle thing that was introduced for the character of Leo James in issue 2. When Gale goes back to his apartment, when they first meet and kind of hook up, he's doing a puzzle. There's puzzle on the table, so we know that's a character thing for him. And so when we see it here, it's a continuing character thing, and it becomes a metaphor for the story. Right. It works on both those levels there. So yeah, but I think I mentioned,
you notice the color of that house. Is bright orange as they're walking up to bright orange in a blue-green city. And it's just like, man, they he never misses an opportunity to reinforce the power of this color scheme.
Yeah, it works all the way through. And so, yeah, for me, again, I think what I said, because the characters, because the tying of threads is important to the characters and to Alice's and Randy's journey, that Barry's journey as musicians, because having them understand and see the ties going back, made that tying together for the audience, for me, the reader, I think it land a little better. If it's just for the reader, if they tied things together to be like, look how clever we are, look what we did, and it was just for the reader to pick up on, I'm with you. Then that's kind of a like, we didn't need to do that. Like that was too much. You're trying too hard. But the fact that it was character important, that our artists in 1977 understood and realized how what they were doing is part of a lineage of what was going back all the way to 1917, that they recognized that and saw that it was important. That made it hit so much more for me. And that's why I appreciated the ending so much.
Well, and I don't know, I mean, how many artists you've seen in concert that do things like this. This is a terrible example because this is blues, not jazz. Which the further back you go, fine lines between them. But there was a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for somebody, and John Mayer was asked to speak. And for his speech, he brought out a guitar, and he was talking about the evolution of this one particular lick. And he's like, so this is how, Robert Johnson did this, B.B. King's version of it, this Albert King's version, and just played them all perfectly. And then got to and here's how Stevie Ray Vaughan took that and did this, and Hendrix did this to it. And it's like, if you just listen to John Mayer jam a blues track, you don't know all the shoulders he's standing on, but he does.
Yeah.
And that's what, I'm not a huge fan of his music, or certainly his person, but I respect how well he articulates all of his influences. And I think it's a really good music education to say, well, what's the thing behind the thing you like? What are the building blocks?
When you were talking about that, it reminded me, there's a really cool documentary called Sound City that Dave Grohl helmed and directed. It's about a recording studio that was out in LA, and this legendary board that they had in their studio. And there's a moment in there, it's all analog, it's old school. There's a moment at the end where they're talking to Brad Wilk, who's the drummer for Rage Against the Machine, and he's talking about how if you're in a band, whatever band that you like that influenced you, what you should do is go back and look at what bands influenced them, and then work your way back through time. And as you're going to go back, you're going to get less and less technology, less and less skills and all that, less and less tools, but you're going to get a history of it. You're going to understand where those artists came from, because just educate yourself on that and work that ladder back, and be knowledgeable of what came before, because that's going to influence how you are as a musician. And that sort of thing you're talking about with John Mayer, right? That he can work his way back through the time, and he understands where it came from, and thus understands where he fits in all of it,
Right.
And
well,
I think
it's Dave Grohl. There's a great interview of him out there talking about Smells Like Teen Spirit and how he was just stealing from, I forget the band, it was a disco band, but it's just
you're right.
And the clip I've seen on Instagram Reels or whatever just shows you straight up how he lifted that, but no one ever thought to put that in grunge.
Yes,
but it was this was the stuff I listened to as a drummer.
It's wrapped in a completely different form.
Right,
but when you
Dave's
isolate it, it's
But that was all in the context of Dave saying, "I'm not a great drummer.
Yeah,
I just take this from this and stick it in this other thing." And people are like, "Oh, how did he think of that?" It's I can't not hear the thing I'm stealing every time I play it.
Yeah. But that's where we end up. That's where we end up with Barry and Alice at the end of the issue here, at the end of our narrative story. Which question mark? We'll come back to that there. But the idea that they now understand where their place is, and they can look back, and now they're in a position where they can look back and maybe shine some more light on an artist or a composer like Gail Geldstein, that we see Alice wanting to dig into that. But we have that connective tissue now that we've come full circle, that now the people that we met at the beginning of the series can maybe now get some recognition that they didn't get during their time,
Yeah, it's very cool. And I think what this book is talking about with jazz, it's also doing for comics. Like, there are callbacks to lots of other comic storytelling techniques and paneling techniques. Yet what we're seeing here is a whole new wave of artists.
Yeah. A lot of whom are mostly unknown and at least for their interior artwork,
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's also the meta approach to that. It's like, we love two things, comics and jazz.
Yeah.
And this book is a great advertisement for both.
It is a way to showcase to showcase art and talk about art and art creation and art criticism. And yeah, I think when you look at that article, The Great Unknown, that was written, and you apply that to any sort of ongoing art form, because comics are the same way. You think about the people that started making comics. Who were those people? How many of them worked and toiled and didn't get the recognition they deserved, but yet they built an industry that's lasted for the past 80 some odd years. It's the same sort of thing you can look back on and have an understanding of. These people came before to help us be where we are now.
Yeah,
you can turn it back on that. So
yeah, so I mean, it works on the jazz level, it works on the comic level. Just this is
the art level.
This is a 5 out of 5 book for me.
Yeah.
Which when I got the first issue, I was like, I really like this, but I don't think I knew it was an anthology after issue 1.
I'm with you. I don't know if I did either. I picked it up because Kyle Higgins, I like it. Oh, it's jazz. This is cool. And I was like, are we going to follow this kid throughout the stories?
I thought, yeah. I was like this, but then we got the second one, and I was like, okay, well, maybe this is like a second plot, and then we're going to weave back, and maybe she'll meet the kid now grown up.
Yeah.
And then it was like, oh, no, that was a cool standalone piece. Then the third one came out. I bought it directly from Kyle, as we were talking about it at GalaxyCon. And I was like, oh, this is like anthology.
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, but... I was like,
yeah, well, he doesn't want to tease how they all come together, but it really does all come together. But I think, after one issue, if you aren't really certain what the story is going to be, if the story had been following Ace Stewart through all of these decades and eras, that would have been cool too. There's a cool story there, and seeing how someone who was there at the quote unquote start moves his way through. There's a cool story there too. There's a version of this, and that totally works. But yeah, you're a little uncertain. I'm with you. A little uncertain when you first started it, but what we got is this incredible weave of stories that tells a full world of jazz, minus the specific. It's a big top down view. You get a real generalized view that allows the reader space to go find more if they're so inclined.
Yeah. So if you like this book, stay tuned, hopefully for a creator interview at some point. Yep. Even if I'm certain we're going to land someone, whether we will land them in time before we start our next series, or if we just kind of have to drop it in retroactively.
May have to double back, but we're working on it. We've talked to some, and we really do, because this is a book that I think we have would be a lot of interesting questions on its creation on its actual work on it.
I mean, I could spend a whole month talking about this book.
Yeah,
and it's one I plan to revisit very, very soon. So hopefully every one of you got to read it, enjoyed it. I think it's worth buying. I'm all about Hoopla, library, however you can get your hands on it. I think it is worth supporting this creative team.
I agree. Yep.
And I think it's worth revisiting the issues, on a somewhat regular basis, especially when you never know. One of these artists could blow up at, Marvel or DC or something and become the new it artist. And you'll have one of their first interior pieces, in a single issue form of deep cuts. So it's always worth, grabbing stuff. And I'm not suggesting you become a speculator. I'm just saying support the artists.
Absolutely. Yeah. Show them that you appreciate their work. And the best way to do that is to buy stuff from them,
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for listening to a slightly extended version of Story Darks. We will be back next week with another 0-episode creator spotlight or the interview following this one.
Yeah, potentially. We'll see.
So we'll know slightly before you do, but not much more. So have a good week, and thanks for listening.
Peace.